Hello everyone. Welcome to the webinar about beginning verification before October 1st. I'm Whitney Peters. I'm a program analyst in the Child Nutrition Office of Program Integrity. I'm joined today by one of my colleagues, Janice Johnston. We're going to be going back and forth and covering topics throughout the webinar, so you'll hear from her in just a minute. First, we want to say welcome and thanks for joining us today. There were over 900 people registered for the webinar, and we're excited that there's a lot of interest in rolling verification and in the Toolkit resources. So let's get started. The primary audience for this webinar is the people who conduct verification, of course, which are local program operators. Also, for monitoring and support purposes, it's important that state agency staff, IT or system staff, and also the vendors that provide verification software to SFAs also know and understand the process. So to give you an idea of what we plan to cover today, Janice is going to start off with a little background, and then we'll get into how to conduct rolling verification after that. I'll start out with some definitions and the basic idea behind the process before we get into the details of sampling. During the rolling verification section, we will take a couple of math breaks where we'll go over some examples, but don't log off right now. It's math that you've done before in the verification process. And then I'll wrap up the discussion with a few side notes, including the potential benefits of conducting rolling verification. Then Janice will take us to the end with a discussion of the resources in the verification toolkit, and that was released earlier this month. So just one last thing before we get started. I want to mention that, as you already probably noticed, that we tend to refer to the process of starting verification early as rolling verification. This is mostly out of habit, and also not to have to say beginning verification before October 1st every time we want to refer to it. But while we may call it that, there are variations on the process that would not actually be considered rolling in the traditional sense of the word. And you'll understand what I mean in a few minutes, but I want to point that out so that it doesn't become a point of confusion later on.
Thanks, Whitney. So now for some background. F&S regulations have always allowed LEAs to begin verification once they have approved applications on file. You may or may not have taken advantage of this flexibility in the past, and we hope that after this webinar, you will have enough information to decide whether these flexibilities would be a good idea for you and your SFA. So you're probably asking, why now? And that's a good question. In the Office of Program Integrity, we have been doing a lot of research on verification practices and response rates. In 2015 and 2016, we partnered with the Office of Evaluation Sciences, which used to be called the Social and Behavioral Sciences team, to do statistical testing, known as randomized control studies, to test interventions to improve household response rates. In 2015, we worked with about 60 districts nationwide. These districts use a redesigned verification notification letter with a friendly look and tone, such as the one pictured here. The thought or hypothesis behind this study makes intuitive sense, that families will be more likely to read and respond to a letter that is personalized and has familiar faces, something we hope is less intimidating than the standard form letter. In addition to the redesigned letter, this study also tested an option for households to submit documentation by taking pictures with their smartphones and emailing them to the district. We received very positive feedback about both the letter and the response options. Many of the participating districts and others around the country have adopted this letter in their verification process. At the end of the webinar, we're going to describe our verification toolkit, and this letter is one of the resources included in that kit. There is also a plain text version of the letter if your system is not able to accommodate pictures and graphics. The new letter template project was followed by a second pilot project in which we tested rolling verification with 4 of the nation's largest school districts. In this test, our volunteer SFAs sent half of their verification letters to households earlier than October 1st, and the other half aligned with their usual practice of sending letters after October 1st. Overall, the study suggested rolling verification has a positive effect on response rates. And we had one unexpected result from this study. The pilot districts felt like beginning the verification process before October 1st was an administrative time saver, and opted to continue conducting rolling verification after the pilot ended. The combination of seeing encouraging increases in verification responses and learning about the potential administrative savings led F&S to publish a memo about rolling verification last September. We wanted to highlight rolling verification as an option to program operators and to vendors that make verification software. And we wanted to provide guidance about how rolling verification could be implemented while still complying with the rules and regulations for verification. The last thing we want to highlight before getting into the details of the process is the potential benefits of beginning verification before October 1st. One is reducing administrative burden, which was a key reason school districts that participated in the pilot opted to conduct rolling verification again the next year. They told us that spreading out the work over several months made the process much more manageable. In addition, if you hire temps in October to help with your verification, you may be able to save some money by doing rolling verification and not having to hire extra help. Another potential benefit is an increase in response rate. The results of the rolling pilot showed that households that were randomly assigned to receive rolling verification notices responded at higher rates, up to 8% higher in one district. And now I'll turn it back over to Whitney.
Great, thanks Janice. Now that we've covered the why, let's talk about the how. We'll discuss the basic concepts and then get into the details after that. But before we get started, I just want to say that while some of this may sound complicated, I'm really only describing a slight variation on the process that you're already doing. So relatively minor software changes can accommodate the process, so try not to get lost in the details. Just hang with me and remember that we'll have time for questions at the end. The first thing we should do is go over some terminology. There are a lot of terms that sound similar in rolling verification, so in hopes of avoiding some confusion, we'll go over them one at a time. Let's start with the term sample. I will be using the word in two different ways throughout the webinar. First, as a noun, meaning the applications that are selected for verification. The applications are the sample. And then second, as a verb, meaning the process of actually selecting the applications, or the act of sampling, if you will. Then there's the sample pool, and this is the group of applications that have the potential to be selected. So in traditional verification, the process most commonly used where you only sample once, the sample pool is comprised of all approved applications. Or if you do error-prone sampling, it would be all approved error-prone applications. But in rolling verification, when you're sampling more than once, the sample pool contains only the applications that were approved since the last sample selection. So you'll see what I mean later when we talk more in depth about sampling, but just to give you a little background on sample pool. Two more terms that also pertain to sampling. There's the sampling percentage, which should be familiar to everyone, and it's either 3 or 1.5%, depending on whether you're doing standard or an alternate verification process. Then there's the sampling frequency, which we use to describe the number of times that you select a sample. The frequency can be a standard interval, like weekly or monthly, or it can be just a number, like 2 or 3. And then there's the sampling interval. The sampling interval is closely related to the sampling frequency, but it's slightly different. It describes the period of time that has passed since the last sample selection. So say your sampling frequency is monthly, the sampling interval would be the 30 days between the sample selections. And the last two terms we'll go over. One is deadline for response, which we use to refer to the date by which households must respond to the verification request. It's not the date on which the benefits are terminated due to non-response. So a deadline would be what you print in your notices to households that say they must submit documents by, say, the 1st of November. So November 1st would be the deadline. And then the last one is the total sample size, which you probably just think of now as your plain old regular sample size. And it's the total number of applications subject to verification for the year. But with rolling verification, when there are multiple samples selected, we need to be able to distinguish the samples that are selected on a rolling basis versus the overall or the total sample size. But it's important to note that under both traditional and rolling verification, the total sample size is the same in the end. It's just that the way that we get to them is different. So now that we're on the same page with the terminology, we can talk about how to actually get started with rolling verification. So one of the first things you would need to do is think about how often you want to sample. You could sample relatively frequently and select applications every week or every other week. Or maybe you want to sample less often, like monthly. Maybe you just want to pick a sample one other times besides October 1st at, say, the end of August. Or maybe you just want to play it by ear and sample whenever you can find time in your schedule. It's really up to you. But when deciding on a frequency, think about how many applications you receive and when they typically come in. It may not be worth it for you if you receive a relatively small number of applications, or if most of your applications are submitted over a short period of time, like a week or two. And then two other important things to note before we move on from the timing of sampling. One is that regardless of how many times you sample, the last sampling interval must always end on October 1st. And this is true whether you're doing rolling verification or traditional verification, so this should sort of be familiar. As you know, with traditional verification, your sampling frequency what we would label as 1, and your sampling interval would be from the first day you start to receive applications through October 1st. But if you sample more frequently, the last sampling interval is from the date of your most recent sample selection, again through October 1st. And then the second thing is also true whether you're doing traditional or rolling verification, and that's that in the end, the number of applications verified still need to meet the statutory requirement, which, as you know, is the lesser of 3% or 3,000 applications that are on file as of October 1st. And the reason I bring this up, as you'll see in a minute, is because there is a chance that the number of applications selected at the end of a rolling verification process may be less than that required amount. And in order to make sure that you verified enough applications, you'll still calculate your total sample size the way that you always have. And then if you find that you're short at the end, you'll just have to select one additional sample to fill out your total sample size. So that would be in addition to the last rolling sample, the one with the interval that ends on October 1st that we just talked about. And if this happens, you'll actually end up selecting two samples at the end, but they'll actually be selected from two different sample pools, which again is the group of applications from which you're randomly selecting your sample, but we'll go over this in more detail later. And again, if this sounds confusing right now, just remember what I said earlier, that this is only slightly different from what you're doing right now, and hopefully your software will do most of the work. Plus, it'll be more clear later when we go over the details of sampling and do a couple of examples. In terms of sampling percentage, there's no matter how many times or when you sample, the percentage stays the same every time. So if you sample every week and you're doing standard sampling, you will select 3% every time. And that's just how math works with percentages. So for example, if you take 3% of an entire population, it will end up being the same as if you broke up that population into 5 groups, took 3% of each, and then added them all up. And then, as you know, the percentage is, again, based on whether you're doing standard or alternate sampling, so it would either be 3 or 1.5%. And then the last thing before we move on is that you will need to decide the deadline or deadlines, plural, by which households must respond. So right now, you most likely have a process where your SFA chooses one response deadline. And like I said, that's the date that you print in your letters to household telling them the date by which households have to send in their documents. But with rolling verification, you actually have a couple of options. You could do most likely what you've been doing in the past and just pick one date for example, you decide that all households must respond by November 1st. But another option is to decide on a set number of days in which households must respond. In other words, you could have rolling deadlines, which would be deadlines that are a set number of days after the household was selected for verification. So however many times you sample, that is essentially how many different deadlines you would have. For example, you could decide that every household gets 45 days to respond with their documentation. So a household that was selected for verification on August 1st would have until September 15th to respond, while a household that was selected on September 15th would have until November 1st to respond. That should give you an idea of how that would work, but hopefully your verification software would allow you to do this, and ideally it would make it easy. And on that note, if you don't already use a software program to manage your verification process, I'm going to guess that you have a relatively small amount of approved applications, and therefore you don't do many verifications. And if that's you, rolling verification may not be the best option for you. And that's not to say that you can't do it, but you will want to weigh the pros and the cons. The hope is that in the end, the webinar, the hope is that at the end of this webinar, you'll have all the information that you need in order to make an informed decision about what would work best for you. All right, so I gave you fair warning, and we're all warmed up after talking about samples and percentages, so let's take our first math break. In a very simple case, let's say you approved 1,000 applications as of October 1st, and you're doing standard error-prone sampling, which is a 3% sample. So that means you would be doing 30 verifications, selected randomly from your error-prone applications. Under the traditional verification process, you would sample all 30 applications on or around October 1st. But let's look at what this example might look like if we spread the verification process out over several months. So in this example, we will do 3 rolling samples and sample on a monthly basis. So let's say that in July, you approve 100 applications. On the first day of August, you calculate your 3% standard sample, and you select 3 applications from your approved error-prone apps. You send out notification letters to those 3 households. Over the month of August, you approve 600 applications, calculate your 3% sample, and select 18 applications, again from your pool of error-prone, and send out letters to those 18 households. And then in September, you approve 300 more. You do the same process and send out 9 more letters. So 3 plus 18 plus 9 gives you a total of 30 applications verified as of October 1st. And since you have calculated, and since you are done with your rolling verification samples, you need to calculate your total sample size based on all approved applications on file as of October 1st. So you add up your 100, 600, and 300 and find that you have exactly 1,000 approved applications. And as we calculated on the last slide, 3% of 1,000 is 30. So all the math worked out in this example. Now we know that applications are not submitted and approved in such convenient numbers or at convenient times, so we're going to do an example in a minute with numbers that require some rounding and where we don't have enough error-prone to fill our sample. But this example was just to give you a basic idea of what it might look like to start verification early. Now let's talk about follow-up for a minute. No matter how you conduct verification, the rules for follow-up are the same as they have always been, so nothing on this slide is new. You are required to send out at least one follow-up reminder notice to households who have not yet responded to the initial notice. And this would apply even if you choose to use rolling deadlines, which, remember, would be a set number of days that a household would have to respond. And it's the same for every household, regardless of when they were selected. So like in our last example where we sampled 3 times, if we decided that everyone got 45 days to respond, you would have to send out at least 3 batches of follow-up notices in order to make sure everyone got at least one follow-up. So you would not be able to send out your follow-up notices all at once. So essentially, if you choose to use the rolling deadlines, Your follow-up notices also have to be sent out on a rolling basis. And as you know, follow-ups can be sent in writing either by mail or email, phone or text message. And two other requirements, which again aren't new, is that the follow-up must be documented and that it must accommodate households with limited English proficiency. So outside of these requirements, there are a lot of options for following up, both in terms of timing and method of contact. And Janice is going to talk about some different and creative ways to follow up later when she goes over some of the resources in the verification toolkit. So stay tuned for that. All right, now we're going to get into the details of sampling. And this is admittedly the most complicated part of rolling verification. So we're going to spend a good amount of time on it so that we cover all of our bases. Let's start with rounding. When you've done verification before, you know that the sample size, if it's not a whole number, it's rounded up. But in rolling verification, since you're sampling multiple times, each rolling sample should be rounded down. And this is to prevent you from oversampling. But as I just mentioned, the total sample size in the end is the same whether you're doing traditional or rolling verification. And then, as we talked about earlier, after you're done with your rolling sampling, you must still calculate your total sample size based on all approved applications on file as of October 1st. And this is essentially the same sample size calculation as you've always done. So as you know, this calculation is rounded up. And that leads me to the point that rounding down can cause a shortage in the number of applications that you verified during your rolling process. So to check that, you need to make sure that the number of applications selected in the rolling samples, or you need to add up the number that you've done in your rolling samples and subtract them from your total sample size. And if there's a difference, you simply select additional applications in one more sample. And we're going to do an example in a minute, and that will help illustrate that. So one last thing to cover before we get into the examples is that for rolling verification, it's important that only applications that were received since the last sample selection are included in the sample pool. And this is important because otherwise conducting rolling verification would essentially penalize households for applying early, because they would be subject to sampling more times technically than a household that applies, say, at the end of September. So to illustrate sampling in rolling verification, here we have a little sample pool that represents our pool of applications. So when you sample only once, as with the traditional verification process, all approved applications go into a single pool. Again, if you're doing standard sampling, only approved error-prone applications would go into the pool. And then you draw your one sample from that pool. But say you're sampling 3 times. In the case of rolling verification, you do not select all 3 samples from the same sample pool. This is how not to conduct sampling in rolling verification. So to illustrate how to sample correctly, we will again use an example where we sample 3 times. After you begin approving applications, and you draw your first sample from the pool of error-prone applications approved to date, when you go to draw your second sample, you only include applications that were approved since the first sample was drawn. You do not draw from applications that were in the first sample pool. And this holds true for all subsequent samples. Each sample is drawn from a separate and distinct pool of applications. And remember that the last rolling sampling interval must end on October 1st. So no matter when sample 2 was selected, the sample pool for sample 3 only includes applications approved since the time when sample 2 was selected up through October 1st. Okay. Now, what about that additional sample that may need to be pulled in order to meet the total sample size requirement? If you're asking yourself, what is the sample pool for that selection, then you're definitely on the right track because it is different. So after completing the total sample size calculation and you see that the number is bigger than the number of applications you've verified so far, one additional sample must be selected. And this additional sample is selected from all error-prone applications approved to date. So again, using our little pools to illustrate, if we have 3 samples selected from separate sample pools, when the total sample size is calculated, if we find that we need to select additional applications, we select them from all applications approved as of October 1st. So all the separate sample pools get combined back into one big pool, and the additional sample is then selected randomly from that pool. And this may be obvious, but I should note that applications that have already been selected for verification should not be in the pool because obviously the same application can't be selected for verification twice. And there's one other consideration with sampling that we need to discuss, and then we'll do an example, which will then hopefully make all of this make more sense. But if you're doing a verification process that requires error-prone sampling, which most of you are, what would happen if you didn't have enough error-prone applications to draw your sample, or from which to pick your sample? And it's our understanding that this is a fairly rare occurrence, but just to cover our basis, we need to go over how it should be handled. So in the traditional verification process, which is likely what you're doing now, only sampling once, if when you go to select your 3% sample among your approved error-prone applications and you find you don't have enough, you immediately then go to your entire pool of approved applications and select randomly. But under the rolling verification process, if you don't have enough error-prone applications to fill any one of your rolling samples, you would only select the error-prone applications that you do have, which would be those approved since your last sample selection. And you would not fill each of those samples by selecting randomly from your non-error-prone apps. So similar to what we talked about with the situation of rounding down, you can make up for any difference at the end if needed with an additional sample to fill out your total sample size. And I'll say this again, if this sounds complicated, it can be handled with relatively minor changes to your system. But it's important to keep in mind that FNS is not requiring your vendors to incorporate any of these suggestions. We're just highlighting this as an option to you to potentially help you with the verification process, but you should explore what's possible with your vendor and or your system administrators. All right, so time to take another math break. This time it's a little bit more complicated and it brings in all the topics that we've covered so far. But it should provide a little bit more realistic picture of what your process could look like. So in this example, we will again sample 3 times, but as I've said, the process is the same whether you sample 3 times or 10 times, so it doesn't really matter. But this time, let's say that in July you approve 114 applications, and this time we're going to indicate how many error-prones there were. So let's say there were 10 approved error-prones. You're doing a standard verification sample, so you calculate that 3% of 114 is 3.4. We're rounding down because this is our rolling verification sample. And so we sample 3 applications from the pool of 10 approved error-prone apps. Then in August, let's say we approve 531 applications. 47 of them were error-prone. We do our calculation. 3% of 531 is 15.9. Round down. We sample 15 error-prone applications from the 47 that were approved since sample 1. And then over the final sampling interval, which would cover from the day that we selected sample 2 up through October 1st, we approve 457 applications. This time only 9 of them were error-prone. So when we find that 3% of 457 is 13.7, we see that we don't have enough error-prone to select all of them. So remember what we just talked about. We select what we do have, which is 9. And so when we add up at the end of our rolling verification process, 3 plus 15 plus 9, we find that we have verified 27 applications. And so when we go to do our total sample calculation based on all approved applications as of October 1st, we find that we have 1,102 applications on file, and that 3% of that is 33.1. Since this is the final overall total sample size calculation, we round up like we're used to doing and find that the total sample size should be 34 applications. But as we just saw, that we've only done 27 so far. So we take 34 minus 27, and we find that we need to sample 7 more applications. Now remember, we're doing standard sampling, so the sample pool only contains approved error-prone applications. So if we add up all of our approved error-prone to date, we get 66 approved error-prone apps, and we know that the same application can't be selected twice, so we remove the 27 that we already sampled, which leaves us with 39 applications in our error-prone sample pool, from which we can randomly select the last 7. So that's it. We made it through all the math, and hopefully you now have a better idea of what sampling will look like in a rolling verification process. And there's just 2 other things that I should mention before we move on. One is that in our example, when we ran out of our error-prone applications because we only had 9, but we needed to select 13, and we just took all 9, what would have happened in that situation if we only had 0, or we had no approved error-prone applications since our last example? And essentially the same rules would apply. We would simply not select any applications during that sampling interval and make up for the difference in the end, just like we did with the 7 apps in the example. And then the last thing is that the same process applies if you're doing alternate 2 sampling and selecting randomly from applications with case numbers. So if any one sample you don't have enough to fill your 0.5%, you just take what you do have and make up for it in the end by selecting randomly, just like we did in the error-prone, just like we did with the error-prone in this example. And now we made it through the rolling verification section. So hopefully you understand the steps you would need to take in your district, and I'm going to hand it back over to Janice to talk about the toolkit.
Thanks, Whitney. And now that we've talked about rolling verification, let's wrap up with a quick tour of the verification toolkit that was released earlier this month. As we already mentioned, we've done work with a number of SFAs over the last couple of years on testing ways to improve verification response rates. So let's take a look at some of the resources that are available in the toolkit. We talked about the studies we conducted with school districts around the country to test strategies to improve response rates at the beginning of the webinar. We also know from the yearly verification collection report, or 742 data, and from speaking with SFA staff around the country, that it's a struggle to get households to respond to verification requests. USDA research also tells us, however, that many of the families that fail to respond to verification are, in fact, eligible for benefits. We talked with SFA staff around the country about their verification practices, and in particular, the steps they take in following up with households after their initial verification letters. We took lots of notes, compiled the information, and analyzed it to see if we could draw any helpful conclusions about effective or ineffective follow-up strategies. You may have also heard about a verification challenge we conducted on challenge.gov, where SFAs submitted entries describing their verification processes and what they do to get households to respond. We took what we learned from all the studies, the conversations, and the challenge, and compiled everything into the verification toolkit that we have been referencing. Some of the resources are designed for the SFAs, such as the one pictured here, while others are things that SFAs can use as is or modify slightly to send to the households. You saw the redesigned notification letter earlier in the webinar. The toolkit also contains a list of research-backed strategies. The resource pictured here is one example, with tips for the initial notices, reminders and follow-ups, and general suggestions. Among the strategies to improve verification responses are making phone calls after 5 p.m. when people are more likely to be home, utilizing email and text messages when possible, and using eye-catching print materials to draw attention to them. The SFAs that we talked with attributed their success to following up many times through a variety of methods. We took what we learned about all the methods these SFAs used to create the page you see here. Another flyer in the toolkit, and one that can be sent directly to households, describes 3 different ways households can submit documentation. The options described here include taking pictures of documents and emailing them, providing an address for households to send their documents through regular mail, and including an address so households can drop documents off in person at the SFA office. Notice that this flyer, in addition to some of the other resources in the toolkit, is designed to be customized so the information is specific to your SFA. You can see the placeholder text identified with greater than and less than signs, where you can customize the form with your email addresses, school district names, phone numbers, etc. The Sources of Income flyer was also created for households. This is a list of all of the includable income sources required on school meal applications and is simply in a format that households can refer to as they're pulling together their documentation. This flyer is particularly important because it puts the household's attention on providing documentation for all of its income sources rather than trying to replicate what was reported on the application. The last household flyer focuses solely on the option to take pictures of documents and email them to school districts. We've mentioned this option a handful of times, and I'm highlighting it again because we think that if we make it easy, households will be more likely to respond to their verification notices. In today's digital environment, these methods may be the best option for households. This particular resource is two-sided, English on one side, Spanish on the other. The toolkit also contains the verification letter template we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. And remember, you can use or adapt the letter in ways that meet your school district's needs and system capabilities. Again, the letter was designed based on the social science research that tells us that people are more likely to respond to colorful, personalized letters. That said, however, we also recognize that including graphics in letters can be more difficult than customizing the text. So we have also created a plain text version of the letter that makes it fairly easy to personalize the letters for each household. Other resources in the toolkit describe rolling verification. These include a diagram illustrating an example of a timeline in which the SFA samples twice, and an example that illustrates the rolling verification process with 5 sampling intervals, highlighting both continuous sampling and follow-up notices to households. The toolkit also contains a math example, just like the ones Whitney just covered on this webinar. And finally, this resource highlights variations in sampling frequency, a visual diagram of the ways rolling verification may allow for a more even distribution of the SFA's workload. But we want to highlight once again that SFAs are free to select whatever method makes sense for the number of verification letters they usually send and their administrative workload. And that is true for everything that we're talking about in the toolkit. All of these optional resources for districts are for you to use as the school district and staff deem appropriate. To close, we want to mention that if you are conducting rolling verification, we want to hear from you. We want to know what you thought of the process and if you did or didn't see any difference in your results. We're also interested in your thoughts about the resources and techniques highlighted in the verification toolkit. So if you have anything to share, email us at opi@fns.usda.gov so we can set up a time to discuss.